family excluded me from the Christmas trip, then called me selfish for locking them out. That sentence still echoes in my head sometimes, not because of how harsh it sounded, but because of how calmly I heard it, like a final tap on a bruise that had been swelling for months. I used to believe that family, even when imperfect, should have each other's backs. I didn't grow up with the illusion of a perfect household, but I did think we were the kind that stuck together when it counted. That illusion shattered one snowy Thursday afternoon, when I came home early and heard my sister-in-law laughing about how much better Iceland would be without me. And what hurt even more was knowing that my entire family had agreed. That was the moment I realized I had been written out of their story quietly, while I was busy funding their chapters. But let me start from the beginning. My name is Stephanie Sue. I'm 33, currently living in Seattle, Washington. Until recently, I worked as a senior marketing strategist at a mid-sized digital firm, but I've since transitioned into freelance consulting. It was a forced change. One I'll get into later. I own a modest townhouse in Ballard. Nothing flashy, but it's mine. 3 bedrooms, warm light in the afternoons, and just enough space for a guest who needed a fresh start. That guest ended up being my older brother Julian and his wife, Talia. Julian is 2 years older than me. He used to work in financial tech before leaving to pursue full-time crypto trading. Talia, his wife, had a well-followed travel blog and influencer platform before the pandemic hit. They married in 2020, what could only be described as a whimsical, performative garden wedding funded largely by our parents. By mid-2022, they had burned through their savings on bad investments, influencer retreats, and what Julian called lifestyle positioning. In plain English, they were broke. I had no intention of becoming their safety net, but when they called me last summer, Talia in tears and Julian oddly quiet, asking if they could crash for just a month or two while they got back on their feet, I said yes, not because I owed them, but because I believed in keeping family close during hard times. They moved in with just 4 suitcases, 2 yoga mats, and an air of disruption I didn't fully recognize until much later. At first, it was manageable. They stayed in the guest room, occasionally helped with groceries, and seemed genuinely grateful. I charged them a token rent barely enough to cover utilities. But as weeks turned into months, things shifted. Talia started treating the kitchen like her studio space, rearranging my spice racks to match her brand's aesthetic and filming content without asking. Julian converted my second bedroom into a temporary trading zone, which essentially meant sitting around in joggers yelling into his headset. They left dishes in the sink, borrowed things without asking, and invited friends over on days they knew I had client meetings. But I held my tongue, believing that patience would eventually be rewarded with progress. They were family, and family deserved grace. Still, I couldn't ignore how they never seemed in a rush to leave. Julian said the market was volatile, and this wasn't the right time to pull out. Talia claimed she was rebuilding her content funnel, whatever that meant. Meanwhile, they ordered Postmates almost daily, bought matching Patagonia jackets, and began making passive-aggressive comments about how structured I was, as if my functioning life was a flaw. By early December, I was counting down to Christmas, looking forward to our family's annual holiday trip. For the past 9 years, our tradition had been renting a cabin for a week's snow, food, board games, and no screens. It was the one time of year we unplugged together. I had already blocked out the time, even bought everyone thermal gloves on sale. I thought this year, maybe, despite all the tension, we'd find that spark again. Maybe the cold air and hot cocoa would thaw the space between us. That illusion collapsed on a Tuesday afternoon when I came home early from a canceled meeting and overheard Talia on the phone in my kitchen. She was laughing, telling someone about the Iceland itinerary and how the geothermal spa had an adults-only section. I thought I had misheard until she added, I know. Right. It'll be such a relief not having Stephanie micromanaging every meal and activity like last year. This time it'll just be easy. She paused. She still doesn't know. Julian told Mom to wait until after the flights were confirmed. She's gonna be pissed. But whatever. I stood in the hallway. Not breathing. Not blinking. The house I paid for. The space I made for them. I was being used as a base camp to plan my exclusion. I didn't confront her then. I just turned and left. Got back in my car. And drove to a parking lot near Green Lake where I sat in silence for an hour. Staring at nothing. Holding my keys so tight, they left marks on my palm. In that moment, it wasn't just about the trip. It was about the months of quiet disrespect that had built up until this was the logical next step, removing me entirely. And feeling justified while doing it. I wasn't invited. I wasn't even considered, and yet, when I finally took back control of my space, they called me selfish. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed, replaying every moment from the past year. Every small instance I had brushed aside as unintentional or harmless. The missing groceries I paid for. The condescending comments about how I liked structure too much. The way they always left the lights on and the dishes undone, like it was someone else's job to care. I kept thinking maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe it wasn't what it sounded like. So I gave them a chance to explain. Not because I thought they deserved it, but because I needed to hear the truth from their own mouths. The next morning, I waited until Julian was in the kitchen alone. I didn't come in hot or hostile. I poured myself coffee and said plainly, "I heard Talia talking about Iceland yesterday." His face went pale for a second, and I saw the moment he decided to lie or tell the truth. "We were going to tell you," he said finally, eyes locked on the toaster like it had the answer. I stayed quiet, letting the silence push him further. Mom booked something different this year. Everyone thought it would be more laid back. I asked if they were all going. He nodded. I asked if anyone had thought I might want to be included in the planning or at least informed. He hesitated, then said, "Look, Steph, the truth is, you can be intense on these trips. Always scheduling stuff, always trying to make it efficient. People just want to relax." He blinked. It felt rehearsed, like he'd been waiting for a reason to finally say what he thought. "So, I'm excluded because I care too much?" I asked. Voice flat. "No, you're excluded because we thought you wouldn't want to come," he said, doubling down. "You always talk about deadlines and Q4 stress." I stared at him. I had requested time off for this trip back in October. I had already bought gifts. I had rearranged 2 major client deliverables to make this time sacred. And now I was being told I was intense, over-involved, problematic. I went to work that day, trying to pretend nothing had shifted. But when I came home that evening, the house smelled like cinnamon candles and hot cider. Talia had decorated the entire living room with garlands, fairy lights, and a huge poster taped across the fireplace that read Arctic Vibes Countdown. There were guests in the house. My parents, my cousin Hannah, even 2 family friends. A full-blown pre-Christmas party in my own home, organized by the very people who had left me out. I stood by the door watching Julian open a bottle of wine I had been saving for New Year's, while Talia passed around gingerbread cookies from my pantry. My mother saw me and did that smile she does when she knows she's caught but pretends she isn't. "Stefania, we were going to clean up before you got home. It's just a small thing," she said, as if I were the one overreacting for walking into my own house. No one else said anything. No one asked if I wanted to join. They all just kept talking, laughing, taking photos in front of the tree I had put up alone. I turned to go upstairs. But before I could leave the room, I heard Talia whisper to someone, "At least she's not crying or making a scene." That would have been so on brand. That's when something in me clicked. Not snapped. Not exploded. Just clicked. like hearing the last note of a song and realizing the melody had always been slightly off. The next morning, I called Mira, my best friend from college, and told her everything. She didn't interrupt or ask questions. She just let me speak until I stopped. Then she said, "You know what you have to do." Right, I did. I just hadn't let myself admit it yet. "They don't see you as a person," she added. "They see you as a tool. Someone who funds the lights, stocks the fridge, and gives them a backdrop to play their roles against." That evening, I started writing a formal notice. Julian and Talia had been here almost a year. Rent was below market, and we had no lease agreement. Ethan, a mutual friend of Mira's and a real estate attorney, confirmed that I was within my rights to begin a 30-day termination of occupancy. It felt brutal, but necessary. I wasn't throwing them out on the street. I was giving them time, space, and notice more than they had given me. The plan was to finalize everything. Wait until they left for their Iceland trip, then change the locks, pack essentials, and reset the space I had once called home. I wasn't angry, not in the traditional sense. I was tired. I was done being used, and I was ready to reclaim my house, my holiday, and my peace of mind. The formal notice sat on my desk for a day before I printed it. I wanted to be sure, not about the decision itself, but about how I delivered it. There was no point in yelling or slamming doors. That would only feed their version of the story, the one where I'm too controlling, too emotional, too hard to live with. I didn't want to give them more ammunition. I just wanted peace. I wanted clarity. I wanted them out. I planned it carefully. Julian and Talia were scheduled to meet our parents for a spa appointment and packing prep that Saturday. They'd be gone for at least 6 hours. I booked a locksmith for the afternoon and borrowed Mira's car to avoid drawing attention to mine being in the driveway. Ethan, who had seen more of this kind of family chaos than he cared to admit, reminded me to document everything: photos, inventory, team stumps. I did exactly that. Packed only essentials, 1 suitcase each. Toiletries, chargers, a week's worth of clothes, and Talia's prenatal vitamins, just in case she was telling the truth about being pregnant. I didn't touch their computers or personal paperwork. I didn't touch anything that felt like it might spark more drama than it already carried. By the time I finished, the house felt like mine again. It was subtle at first, but the energy had shifted. The silence no longer felt heavy. The floors echoed in a way I hadn't heard in months. I taped the notice to the box of essentials and left a copy in their bedroom, placed neatly on the stripped mattress with a post-it that read, "You have 30 days. Please coordinate via email." Then I changed the locks and reset the alarm code. It wasn't until that evening that the calls started. First Julian, then Talia, then my mother. Each voicemail more dramatic than the last. Julian said, I was violating basic human decency. Talia cried about being emotionally traumatized. My mother didn't yell. She used disappointment, that heavy sigh laced with guilt, as if I had ruined Christmas and family in one stroke. I didn't respond to any of them. Not because I wanted to punish them, but because I knew there was no version of this conversation that wouldn't be twisted and weaponized against me. I had tried speaking up before. I had tried reasoning. Now, I was choosing silence and structure. The next morning, my Aunt Catherine called. She rarely involved herself in family politics. She lived in Oregon, taught art part-time, and mostly kept to herself. But she had heard from my mother that I had gone nuclear and decided to check in. I told her everything, not as a rant, but as a timeline. I gave her dates, context, screenshots, even a photo of the Iceland itinerary Talia accidentally left in the kitchen trash. She listened quietly, then said, "Stephanie, your mom has always had a blind spot for Julian. It's not you. It never was. She's been making excuses for him since you were kids." It wasn't new information, but hearing someone else say it out loud made the air feel clearer. 3 days later, Julian and Talia showed up. They rang the bell for over 10 minutes. Then knocked. Then pounded. I didn't answer. Through the peephole, I watched them alternate between confused and furious. Eventually, they spotted the boxes on the porch. Talia cried. Julian kicked a decorative planter I had just bought the week before. Then they left. The next morning, I woke up to a social media post. Talia had uploaded a photo of the porch, blurred my house number, and captioned it, "When family throws you out knowing you're pregnant, forgive, but never forget." It was vague enough to avoid legal risk, but targeted enough that mutual friends started commenting. Some offered sympathy. Others messaged me privately, asking if I was okay. A few unsubtle relatives reposted it with heartbroken emojis. Mira called to ask if I wanted to go public with the truth, but I said no. I didn't want to fight for a narrative. I wasn't interested in convincing the internet who was right. What mattered now was space. What mattered was resetting the ground I stood on and deciding who I let near it. But the silence didn't last long. That week, I got an envelope in the mail. A letter from an attorney, not a lawsuit, just a threat. A formal complaint alleging emotional distress and unlawful eviction. Despite the fact that I had followed every legal step, Ethan laughed when I sent him a photo of it. "They're fishing," he said. "They have no case. Let them burn their money if they want to. Just don't engage." I wanted to believe it was over, that they'd lick their wounds and find somewhere else to redirect their mess. But deep down, I knew better. Families like mine don't walk away when control is at stake. They regroup. They reframe. They find new ways to come back through the side door. And I needed to be ready for that. Christmas Eve came with a quiet snowfall that dusted the sidewalks like powdered sugar. Too delicate to last, but enough to change the way everything looked for a moment. I had planned to spend the day alone, cooking for myself, staying offline, maybe watching one of those slow-burn detective shows where no one talks unless it matters. But around noon, Mira texted me asking if I wanted to join her and Ethan at his parents' open house. "No pressure," she said. "Just food, dogs, and zero holiday drama." At first, I said no. I didn't want to show up somewhere feeling like a project or an outsider. But the silence of my house started pressing in like fog. Not heavy, but present. I packed a box of cookies, put on a soft gray sweater, and told her I was on my way. Ethan's parents lived in a craftsman home on the east side. Warm lights in the windows. The smell of spiced cider in the air. No one asked probing questions or gave tight-lipped smiles. Instead, they handed me a cup of cocoa, complimented the cookies, and introduced me as our Stephanie, with the kind of casual kindness that I hadn't realized I missed. Someone's grandmother hugged me for no reason. A teenager taught me how to play a card game I hadn't seen since college. It was, strangely, the most peaceful Christmas I could remember. There was no performance, no obligation, no walking on eggshells to keep someone else's mood from tipping. Just warmth, and space, and laughter that didn't come with side eyes or forced politeness. That night, after I got home, I sat on the couch and stared at the small ceramic ornament Aunt Catherine had sent me in the mail. It was hand-painted, dated this year, with a single word written in gold: choice. She had included a note that simply said, "New traditions start when old ones no longer serve." I didn't cry. I didn't feel bitter. I just breathed deeply and let myself feel what I hadn't in months. Relief. I didn't need to explain myself anymore. Not to Julian. Not to my mother. Not to the extended family that had chosen to believe curated captions over quiet truth. Of course, the calm didn't last forever. On the 27th of December, I received an unexpected email from my workplace's front desk. Julian and Talia had shown up unannounced, asking to speak with me. They weren't aggressive, just persistent. I wasn't there that day. Thankfully, the front desk staff turned them away after confirming I wasn't scheduled. But the message rattled me. They knew where I worked. They had chosen to cross that boundary too. I called Mira and asked if I was overreacting. She didn't even let me finish the question. No, she said. They're escalating because you're not giving them what they want. That's not love, Stephanie. That's control in a nicer outfit. Later that week, I received a voicemail from Julian. He sounded calm, measured, even conciliatory. Steph, he said, we want to talk. Things got out of hand. Talia's pregnant, and we're just trying to figure things out. Maybe we can come back and live separately. Maybe the basement only. Just until spring. I didn't respond. I didn't trust the shift in tone. It felt rehearsed, not real. The very next day, Talia posted an ultrasound photo with a caption about healing from betrayal. The comments were exactly what you'd expect people offering support. Friends tagging each other, saying some sisters are just jealous. I didn't engage. I just muted the post, closed the app, and opened a blank document. I titled it, What I Want From Here, and started writing. Not a business plan. Not a revenge blueprint. Just small things, peaceful mornings, honest relationships, space that felt safe. Around New Year's, my father showed up at my door. Alone. He looked older than I remembered. Maybe from the stress. Maybe because I hadn't really looked at him without my mother's voice in the background for years. We sat at the kitchen table. He didn't defend anyone. He didn't ask me to reverse anything. He just said, I should have said something earlier. I saw what was happening. I just didn't want to be the one to set off the bomb. That felt familiar. He'd always chosen stillness over friction, even when that meant letting harm unfold. I didn't absolve him, but I appreciated the honesty. Before he left, he said something that stayed with me. Sometimes the person who speaks up first gets painted as the problem, but it doesn't make them wrong. That sentence felt like a hinge between chapters, between the girl I had been quiet, reliable, low maintenance, and the woman I was becoming, who knew that silence wasn't the same as peace. By mid-January, the house was mine again, in a way it hadn't been in almost a year. Julian and Talia didn't come back to retrieve the rest of their belongings themselves. Instead, my father returned one afternoon with a small moving van and 2 college-age helpers who barely made eye contact as they carried boxes out. He didn't say much. Just asked where the labeled items were and quietly signed the release form Ethan had suggested. I prepare? There was no hug. No closure. No last plea for understanding. Only a worn man doing the job his son didn't have the dignity to do himself. I stood in the hallway and watched as the last box was lifted, the door closed, and the engine hummed off down the block. That silence afterward was more satisfying than I expected. No bitterness, just absence, which felt like a gift. I spent the next weekend deep cleaning the spaces they had occupied, scrubbing baseboards, replacing curtains, airing out closets. I took down Talia's pastel wall calendar that still had her social pushes mapped out in bubble letters and tossed the fake plants she'd used for background aesthetics. I painted one wall in the guest room, a soft green, not because it needed it, but because I wanted the smell of change to linger. There was no rage in my actions, just a steady reclaiming. Every drawer I reorganized, every shelf I wiped down. I was a quiet reminder that I still had control over my life, even if it had taken me too long to remember it. That Monday, I returned to my freelance projects with renewed focus. January was slow in my industry, but I started reaching out to contacts, offering strategic planning sessions for small teams and independent creators. What surprised me was the response. People I hadn't heard from in years suddenly resurfaced, curious, supportive. asking what I was building next. I didn't give them details. Not yet. But I took the energy they offered and funneled it into something new. Not a company, not a brand. Just an idea. Clean. Intentional. Quiet. Then, something strange happened. 2 weeks after the move out, a clip surfaced in a niche creator forum. I occasionally browsed. It was Talia. A screen recording from an influencer panel she had joined the year before, bragging about how some women just don't get it when they're being used. Like, they think giving someone a place to crash makes them saints. The panel laughed. She smiled. I watched it 3 times. Not because I was shocked, but because I finally saw her clearly. This wasn't someone who made a mistake. This was someone who had always believed she was entitled to other people's resources, as long as she wrapped it in soft language and curated filters. I didn't post it, but someone else did. And when it landed in a mutual friend's story with the caption starting to make sense now, it began to spread. Slowly, quietly, like cold water seeping into a cracked foundation, people began unfollowing her. A few unfriendly DMs leaked. Then Julian deleted his social media entirely. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel responsible for how it unfolded. I had done nothing but protect my space. And the consequences they were now facing were not my burden to carry. One evening, Mira and I sat on my balcony, sipping tea, while the sky turned a soft amber. She asked if I had closure. I said no. But I had clarity. That was enough. Closure felt like something people on talk shows demanded for resolution. But clarity, that let me move forward. I told her I didn't hate Julian and Talia. I just didn't trust them. And I wasn't interested in rebuilding something that had only stood because I kept propping it up alone. We talked about starting something together. Not a business. Not yet. But a workshop series for women who'd gone through familial gaslighting and needed help finding their voice again. She had the PR experience. I had the strategy. It felt right. Not like revenge. More like using the wreckage to build something honest. Something useful. That night, I drafted the first outline for what would later become our pilot session. I called it Reclaiming the Room. Not because I had all the answers, but because I knew how it felt to sit in a space you created and still feel like a guest in your own life. A few weeks after that conversation with Mira, I received a message from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. It was Hannah, one of our cousins on my mother's side. We were never close. Mostly because she lived in Denver and only showed up at weddings or milestone birthdays. Her message was short but direct. I know what they said about you. I never believed it. Just wanted you to know that. It caught me off guard. I hadn't realized how many people might have been watching all of this unfold silently. I replied with a simple thank you and didn't expect anything more. But she wrote back the next day with something I didn't see coming. Apparently, during the Iceland trip, Julian had tried to spin the story in a way that made me sound mentally unstable. He told people I had a meltdown, accused them of stealing, and kicked them out without warning. Talia had added to it by claiming she feared for her safety and that I was spiraling because I was single and childless at 33. According to Hannah, some family members bought it completely. Others weren't sure. But nobody questioned it aloud because they assumed I wouldn't show up to defend myself. And in a way, they were right. I hadn't gone on a public defense tour. I hadn't counter-posted. I hadn't called anyone to explain my side. I had simply chosen silence, which in our family often gets mistaken for guilt. That information settled deep inside me like cold water. Not painful, just clear. It confirmed what I had started to suspect. This wasn't just a conflict about a house or a holiday trip. It was a character assassination carried out behind my back. And the price of not engaging had been my reputation in rooms I wasn't even in. I took a long walk that night through my neighborhood, wrapped in my heaviest coat, letting the cool air keep me grounded. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. But something hardened slightly inside me. Not bitterness. Just resolve. If they were going to rewrite the story, then I would write my own. By February, reclaiming the room was no longer just a document on my desktop. Mira and I had secured a small community venue, drafted our first 3-session structure, and opened registration quietly through her PR network. We didn't advertise it on social media. We didn't use flashy language. We just framed it as a guided series for women, learning to re-establish voice and space after family conflict or emotional erasure. We capped the first group at 12 people. All 12 spots filled within 48 hours. Our first session was quiet, almost hesitant. No one wanted to overshare, but as the hours passed, something shifted. One woman talked about being written out of her father's will after years of caregiving. Another spoke about raising her younger siblings while being blamed for their failures. And then, as if pulled forward by invisible thread, they began connecting the dots. None of us had the same story, but all of us knew what it felt like to give everything and still be framed as difficult. To be the one who broke the cycle and still got blamed for the cracks. After the final session, one participant lingered behind. She told me something I'll never forget. You didn't just give me tools. You gave me permission to stop apologizing for existing. I thanked her, held her words gently, and wrote them in my journal later that night. They reminded me of what I had needed a year ago. Not a solution, not validation, just the space to exist without having to perform worthiness. That spring, I hosted a small gathering at my house. Nothing dramatic, just a few new friends, some fresh flowers, music low enough that no one had to shout. For the first time, my home felt full without feeling invaded. Mira brought lemon tarts. Ethan grilled on the patio. Someone's toddler danced in the hallway wearing one of my socks as a hat. I caught myself smiling without hesitation, not because I wanted to prove anything, but because the moment simply allowed it. Near the end of the night, Mira nudged me and said, "It feels different here now." I nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. The walls no longer echoed with held tension. The rooms no longer smelled of resentment, masked with air freshener. It wasn't just about getting Julian and Talia out. It was about unlearning the version of myself that believed I had to tolerate being erased just to keep the peace. The first time I saw Julian again was almost 6 months after everything. It wasn't planned. I was at the downtown market on a Saturday morning, picking up fresh herbs for a recipe Mira had sent me. He was there with Talia, walking out of a boutique baby shop, pushing a stroller. I recognized the jacket first, the one our mom had bought him 2 Christmases ago. For a moment, I wondered if they saw me. Then I realized it didn't matter. I didn't change direction. I didn't rush past or stop to stare. I just kept walking, steady, like I had every right to be there. Because I did. Later that day, I told Mira about the encounter. She asked how I felt. The truth was, I didn't feel much. Just a strange stillness. Like seeing a dream you'd already woken up from. It wasn't anger. It wasn't regret. It was neutrality. And that, to me, felt like progress. I didn't care about their child. Not in a cruel way. But in the way you stop caring about people who never learned how to treat you right. I hoped the baby would grow up surrounded by more accountability than its parents had shown. But I didn't need to know more than that. In late spring, my mother reached out again. She emailed, then followed up with a printed card. It was cream-colored with gold foil script that read, "Let's begin again." Inside, she had written a note in her tidy, cursive, saying she missed me, that families made mistakes, and that forgiveness was part of healing. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what had been said about me, or what had been done in my home. Just a soft reset, as if nothing had really happened, and we could skip the part where trust had been broken. I folded the card and placed it in a drawer I no longer opened often. By that point, I had already made peace with not being the daughter who kept everything together. For years, I had carried that role like a quiet obligation, trying to be the stable one, the reasonable one, the bridge between conflict and resolution. But something about being excluded so casually, so deliberately, I had taught me a lesson I hadn't known I needed. Some bridges only lead to fires, and choosing not to cross them isn't cowardice. It's survival. That summer, Mira and I expanded our workshop. We called it the Quiet Rebuild, and offered it virtually, so women outside Seattle could join. One woman joined from Texas, another from Nova Scotia. Their stories varied in detail, but echoed the same chord. Families who resented boundaries, siblings who spun narratives, parents who weaponized silence. These weren't isolated cases. They were patterns, repeated in different homes with different faces but familiar energy. And the more I heard them speak, the more I realized how little language we have for what it means to grieve a family that's still alive. One afternoon, during a quiet moment between sessions, I got a call from Aunt Catherine. We hadn't spoken since the holidays, but she'd stayed in touch with occasional postcards. She told me she had spoken to my mother, who was still confused by my distance. "She thinks you're being stubborn," Catherine said, her voice gentle. "She's not ready to see her own part in it." I asked if she thought I should respond. Catherine paused, then said something that felt like permission. I didn't know I was waiting for. "You don't owe her closeness just because she's used to having it. You get to decide the terms now." That night, I wrote a letter. Not to send, just for myself. It started with, "I'm not the version of your daughter that made you comfortable. I'm the version that finally learned to stop performing comfort for everyone else." I ended it with, "If we're going to start again, we have to start with truth, not invitations." I folded the paper, slid it into the back of my journal, and felt a strange sense of relief, like I'd finally said what needed saying, even if no one else would hear it. The truth is, healing doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes, it looks like redefining your center of gravity. Sometimes, it's a new dinner table with different people who ask how you're really doing and stay for the answer. And sometimes, it's just you, sitting alone in a home you reclaimed, watching the light move across your own floor, knowing no one else gets to rewrite what peace means to you again. It wasn't until early autumn that I heard from Julian again. This time, it wasn't a voicemail or an email, but a hand-delivered envelope left at my door in his handwriting. Inside was a folded piece of printer paper with only one sentence: "We'd like to talk. Just the three of us." He signed it with his name and left a contact number I already had memorized but hadn't used in over 9 months. I placed the letter on my kitchen counter, stared at it for several minutes, and then walked away. I didn't respond that day, or the next. Instead, I went about my routines, let time settle around the message, and waited to see how it felt when the shock wore off. By the end of the week, curiosity won over avoidance. I didn't want to talk because I expected change. I wanted to talk because I needed to hear whether they understood anything at all about what had happened. I texted a simple reply. "Fine. 1 hour. Neutral place. No surprises." We met at a quiet coffee shop halfway between our homes. A place we used to go as kids when our parents gave us allowance for hot chocolate and pastry trays. When I walked in, they were already seated at the corner table. Talia had her sunglasses resting on her head, and Julian looked like he hadn't slept in days. They didn't hug me. They didn't apologize right away either. Instead, Talia started with a rehearsed smile and said, "You look great. Really grounded." I didn't answer. Julian cleared his throat and jumped in. "We just wanted to talk. No pressure. We know things got complicated." I nodded slowly, waiting. They fumbled through vague acknowledgments about how the holidays had been chaotic and how stress had made everyone act differently. They mentioned the baby, the financial pressure, The fear of losing family. Still, no one said the word sorry. Not once. So I asked, why did you feel it was okay to exclude me from the trip and use my house as your party venue, without even asking? The question made Julian look down, and Talia twist her wedding ring. Finally, she said. Honestly. Because we thought you'd make it about you. You always take over things. It felt easier without that energy. There it was again. That same accusation dressed up as concern. I exhaled slowly, letting it sit there between us. So instead of talking to me like adults, you made me the villain and threw a party in my home while I was funding your life, I asked. Still, calm. Julian looked up and said, I didn't realize how far we let things go. I think I got used to it. You always taking care of things. And when you stopped, we didn't know how to handle it. I nodded again. That's the problem. You never had to know. You just assumed I'd keep tolerating it because I always had. Talia spoke again. Softer this time. I am sorry for how we handled it. I was angry. And I made it personal when it wasn't. The apology was late and shallow. But it was something. I didn't forgive them. I didn't promise anything. I just told them what I needed them to hear. I'm not interested in fixing the past. I'm only interested in protecting my future. And that future doesn't include letting you back into my home or my peace. We sat in silence for a while after that. They nodded, eventually stood up, and left, without trying to hug me. I stayed behind, sipping the last of my coffee, watching the light shift through the window like it always did around late afternoon. I didn't feel victorious or vindicated. I felt steady, like I had stood my ground without turning to stone. Later that night, I texted Mira and told her how it went. She sent me a single word: proud. I smiled at my phone, not because I needed her praise, but because I had finally started to believe I deserved it. That conversation hadn't changed anything materially. Julian and Talia were still who they were. But now I was different. Not colder, not harder, just clearer. Clarity had become my currency. I no longer invested in relationships hoping to be seen. I started showing up already, knowing my worth. And it changed everything about how I moved through rooms, through choices, through days that once felt heavy with obligation. I had finally made peace with the most painful truth of all. Sometimes, the people you grew up with can't grow with you. And that's not a failure. It's just a fact. The fall passed quietly, marked by small routines that gradually became rituals. Morning walks before emails. Afternoons spent drafting new workshop material. Evenings with soft jazz playing while I cooked for no one but myself. There was something healing about that kind of simplicity. I had spent so many years adjusting myself around other people's expectations that I had almost forgotten what my own preferences even were. Now, each decision I made, what tea I drank, what candles I burned, what time I turned in was mine alone. And that control became a form of quiet joy. One afternoon in October, I got a message from Barbara, a former coworker I hadn't spoken to since leaving my old job. She said she'd been following the workshops from a distance, that she'd heard about the quiet rebuild from a client of hers, and wanted to know if I'd be open to designing something similar for her company's internal leadership retreat. At first, he hesitated. My story was personal. My process was built in response to pain, not corporate development goals. But the more we spoke, the more I realized how universal these dynamics actually were. In families, in teams, in communities' boundaries. Clarity and repair weren't optional anymore. They were essential. So I said yes. We piloted a session in November. It wasn't grand or performative. Just 15 women sitting in a sunlit conference room, talking about what it means to take up space without apology. The feedback was immediate and powerful. One executive VP told me afterward that she hadn't cried in 5 years until that day. Not because of weakness, but because she finally felt safe enough to be human in a room full of professionals. Another said it gave her the language to explain to her husband why she no longer wanted to host his parents every other weekend. The shift was quiet but seismic. That same week, I received a long email from my mother. It was more thoughtful than her previous notes. She said she'd been doing some reflection, that she'd spoken to Aunt Catherine, and even read part of the Reclaiming the Room transcript online. She didn't apologize outright, but there was something softer in her tone. She wrote, "I see now that I may have contributed to the imbalance between you and your brother. I'm still learning how to be better at this stage of my life. It wasn't everything I needed, but it was something, a doorway, not a destination." I didn't write back right away. I gave it a week. Then, instead of responding with emotion, I answered with clarity. I thanked her for reaching out, acknowledged the effort, and set clear conditions for any future reconnection. I told her I was open to a conversation if it came with accountability, not just reflection, that I wouldn't re-enter a dynamic where I had to prove my pain before it was believed. And that trust, for me, was a process, not a performance. She didn't reply immediately. But when she did, her message was short. "I understand. I'm willing to try." I didn't expect that sentence to change me, but it did. Just a little. It made me consider, for the first time, that maybe this wasn't about cutting people out of my life forever. Maybe it was about demanding a new shape to the connection, one that honored who I'd become, not who they remembered. By December, our workshops had expanded to include small group coaching. We weren't chasing scale or viral attention. We were building something slow and intentional. The kind of space I would have needed last year when I felt like I was the only one drowning in a story that everyone else insisted wasn't real. One evening, after a session, a younger participant approached me and said, "The first time I heard your story, I felt less crazy." I nodded and told her, "That's how you know it's working. When someone else's honesty gives you permission to believe your own." That Christmas, I didn't go to Iceland. I didn't go to any snowy cabin. I stayed home. I hosted a dinner for 6 people I had met over the course of the year. None of them related to me by blood. All of them chosen with care. We laughed over mismatched place settings. Burned the first round of stuffing. Watched a movie. No one finished, because the conversation was too good. No performance. No passive-aggressive tension. No forced traditions. Just peace that had been earned, not inherited. As the evening wound down, Mira leaned across the table and said, "You know, this is probably the most honest holiday I've ever had." I looked around the room. I took in the softness of it all, and simply said, "Me too." A few days before the new year, I stood by my window as the last golden light of December bled across the tops of the trees. The house was quiet, not because it was empty, but because it was finally full of the right kind of silence. Not tension, not resentment, just space. I watched the shadows stretch along the floor and thought about everything that had changed in a year. Not just the people I had let go of, but the version of myself I had released in the process. The one who tolerated too much in the name of love. The one who said yes when everything in her body screamed no. The one who mistook being accommodating for being strong. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Julian. Not at Talia. Not even at my parents. What I felt now was something softer, but stronger. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a quiet understanding that people can only meet you where they are. And if they refuse to grow, it's not your job to shrink so they feel tall again. That understanding didn't make me feel superior. It made me feel free. I didn't get the apology I deserved from everyone. I didn't get some cinematic reunion or final confrontation where they begged to be let back into my life. What I got was better. I got a life I designed on my own terms. I got mornings where I woke up without that heavy ache in my chest, wondering, who would disappoint me next? I got people who respected my space because I stopped inviting those who didn't. That's the thing about boundaries. At first, they feel like walls, but eventually, they become windows. You begin to see clearly who belongs in your life and who only benefited from your lack of protection. Mira and I continued growing the workshop quietly. We never chased viral attention. We built depth, one conversation at a time, one woman at a time. Each session reminded me that my story wasn't unique, but it was still important. Because the more we tell the truth about what hurt us, the harder it becomes for that kind of harm to stay hidden in the shadows. And somewhere in the telling, healing begins. Not all at once, but enough to take the next step forward, without dragging all the old weight behind you. New Year's Eve was simple. No fireworks, no crowd. Just a small dinner with 3 women I trusted completely and a soft playlist echoing through the house. At midnight, we raised glasses to a year that didn't break us, to losses that revealed what we never needed, to clarity that came not in thunder but in quiet resolve. I looked around the table, took in their tired eyes and open laughter, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Safety. Not the kind you beg for, the kind you build. Brick by honest brick. Until one day you realize you no longer flinch when the doorbell rings. Sometime past 1 a.m., after the last dish was rinsed and the lights were dimmed, I walked back to the same window. The city was still, wrapped in its own hush. I didn't make any resolutions. I didn't whisper promises to the stars. I simply stood there, breathing in the peace I had protected, and asked myself one quiet question. How many of us have mistaken survival for peace, when all along we were allowed to want more? I don't know what this next year will bring, but I know who I am now. I am someone who came back to herself after being left behind. I am someone who stopped waiting to be chosen and started choosing. I am someone who knows that locking the door wasn't an act of cruelty, it was an act of finally coming home. And if you're listening to this, if your heart aches in places you can't name yet, if you've been made to feel too much, too hard, too complicated just for asking to be treated with care, maybe this is your year to come home too. What would it look like if you stopped apologizing for your boundaries and started honoring them instead? That's the real question. And maybe, just maybe, you already know the answer.